Welcome. You're tuned in to another episode of the Vigilate Dialogues. I am your host, Shaina Smith, welcoming you to the National Boardroom. Tonight, we're looking forward to an interesting conversation as usual. Our guest this evening is Mr. Christopher Varlack, the Chief Records Management Officer at the Archives and Record Management Unit. Welcome, Mr. Varlack.
Thank you, Shaina, for having me.
Great. So tonight, we're going to talk about archives and record management. I know this is a topic persons may have heard of but not be very familiar with. So we hope to get some good information out there and let everybody know why it's important to keep good records.
I'll try to do my best.
All right. So let's start off. What is the Archives and Records Management Unit?
Well, the Archives and Records Management Unit is basically the agency of government that is responsible for providing guidance on records management throughout all government agencies, but is also responsible for preserving and managing the archives, which are records that have passed out of current use and are now in archival stage and should be preserved for future generations.
Okay, and this is specifically for the government, or is this the entire society?
Well, our remit is of a national scale. Similar to the public library, that is a national depository. We take in records from throughout the territory, public and private. So, you know, we have a responsibility both to the government, but also to the territory as well.
Okay, awesome. So what are some of the activities of the unit?
Well, some of the things that we do are, for instance, you may know about our Today in Virgin Islands history program. We started that program way back. It started with my predecessor, actually, Mrs. Verna Penmall, who was a chief librarian at one point. And then she was brought in to head up the Archives and Records Management program. And when she did begin that, she brought with her from the public library the Today in Virgin Islands history program and got it going again.
Okay.
So that's part of our outreach. But some of our fundamental responsibilities are giving guidance to government departments on good records keeping. Additionally, we help in terms of responses to disasters and so on. We've had some some unfortunate incidents that have happened recently, and you know, we've had to assist certain departments with, you know, sort of cleanup and getting their records back in shape. Okay. But we're also responsible for training and ensuring that government offices are equipped to know how to manage their records and to deal with disasters when they happen.
Okay, so we're talking in terms of paper copies, or is it both paper and electronic records?
Yeah, well, we take our cue from the Archives and Records Management Act, which was passed in 2010. And the Act doesn't make any distinction between physical and electronic records. Okay. So we do have a responsibility to give guidance on the management of both. However, the matter of electronic records gets a little ticklish because we have a few other agencies that are responsible for managing electronic records in the government. So we try to work along with them as best as we can to ensure that we can preserve the electronic records as well.
Okay, so having worked in government, I remember we had a certain time period that we were supposed to hold records for. So we may have moved them out of the office, but then they would go into storage in the basement in terms of, you know, because we had to keep them. What's the time period that we have to preserve records for?
Yeah, well, it varies. We have what are called retention schedules, which sort of delineate the time period that offices have to keep their records. And but it depends on the function of the records.
Okay.
There are some that have a long retention period, like human resource records. You know, in certain cases, you may need those records to refer back to, especially if you are creating official histories of certain persons who have worked in government, or if you're trying to gather information on certain individuals for understanding retirement and pension benefits and so on. So there are certain cases where the retention periods are quite long.
Okay.
Sometimes 50, 70 years, depending.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it depends. And then there are certain other records that have very short retention periods. Like a lot of financial records, the retention period is only 7 years.
Okay.
In some cases, like for applications, human resource applications, 1 year.
Okay.
But then there are some that are slated for permanent preservation, in which case the retention period may be for a short or a long period, but then once it's transferred to the archives, we're responsible to hold on to it for, well, forever.
Okay, you believe it.
As long as we can, as
Yeah.
long as we're able to manage
possible.
it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because then if it's a physical record, we know it's gonna eventually it's gonna deteriorate at some point. So are we trying to capture these things electronically?
Yes. The matter of deterioration is one that is inevitable, but I think, as with anything else, a car, for instance, I think once you put a car or keep a car garaged, you help to increase its value and preserve its value for the life of the vehicle, right? Similarly, if you keep records housed under the right conditions, you can extend their life for as long as possible, and in many cases that requires a very special set of circumstances. Of course, a secure building, air conditioning, the right type of enclosures and boxes, and so on. But yes, we are working towards ensuring that we can capture a lot of the information that's in these physical records electronically.
Okay.
But it's a very time-consuming process, and the equipment to do it is not cheap either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can imagine. But it is very important that we do so, though.
Absolutely.
Great. So, for those who don't know what archiving is, what is archiving? Like the layman's description of it. When I archive something, what does that mean?
Basically, ensuring that the records that you have created are kept for as long as you need to have them for future use.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's as basic as we can get.
So it's kind of like a library then?
Similar. A library usually works with materials that are of a secondary nature.
Okay.
In that the persons who have written books or manuscripts have usually done a significant amount of research and have gone to either primary or secondary or tertiary sources and have compiled all of that information, and then they've written their books. With us, a lot of what we seek to retain is actually of a primary nature, which means that these are records that were created firsthand, whether in a government office or it may be the manuscript of someone who has written their memoirs or something of that nature.
Okay.
So, what we preserve are usually primary documents, whereas in a library, they're usually of a secondary or tertiary nature.
Okay. So how would the public access the archives? Because you mentioned about persons doing research.
Yes.
So what's that process like?
Well, we have a form that we ensure everyone fills out once they approach us about gathering information. And that helps us to track our patrons. It's quite fascinating, actually, when you look at the areas that a lot of persons come from looking for information. We get people from Ireland, Australia.
Okay.
So
they're looking for like family history information?
Family history information.
Okay.
The number one use of archives in the world, family history and genealogy. Yeah.
Because then birth and death records would be included in there?
Yes.
Okay.
And although we do have some access to birth and death records, the main point of contact for birth and death records in the territory legally is the civil registry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they're also part of the, I should say, the network, as it were.
We work very closely together. In fact, our office, our main office, is we share the same office space with them, which is upstairs, the Burham building. I think in time they will be moving to another location.
Okay.
And hopefully in time we may be moving to another location as well. I don't know when that will be in either case, but you know, we wait to see what happens.
Okay, great. If you are just tuning in, you're tuned in to the Vigilante Dialogues. I'm your host, Shaina Smith. With me, I have as my guest the Chief Records Management Officer, Mr. Christopher Varlack, and he's been sharing with us about the Archives and Records Management Unit. We will take a word from our sponsors and be right back. Welcome back. You're tuned in to the Vigilante Dialogues. I'm your host, Shaina Smith, welcoming you back to the National Boardroom. Tonight we're talking about archiving and records management. I know this may seem like a strange topic, but it is very important. So with me tonight, I have the Chief Records Management Officer, who is best to tell us about this topic, Mr. Christopher Varlack. And if you just tuned in, you missed about basically the backdrop of what the unit does and the importance, we're going to touch on now, the importance of record management. So, Mr. Varlack, tell us why record management is important to the society, because I know persons may be thinking, you know, this is a fancy word for filing, and usually, you know, we just think of a lot of filing cabinets, but from what you've explained so far, this is a very technical and, you know, sophisticated process, and it's something that's very important because, you know, 10, 20 years from now, or even 50 years from now, we're saying that we would want to have records around so that those that are coming after us are able to know what happened or use it for research and various other activities.
Yeah. Well, if I can take you back to the origins of the unit, I think I mentioned earlier that I may have mentioned, but we started up in 2004, and the motivation for starting the unit was actually an incident that took place with some of our oldest records, records that went back to about the 17 and 1800s.
Okay.
They were actually destroyed through a series of events that really didn't need to happen. At any rate, at that point, the Deputy Governor took the initiative to ensure that we could hold on to the few records that we have from that time period, which I must add, you know, are quite sought after by certain individuals from the United Kingdom, especially, who are doing a lot of research.
So this is a big responsibility this unit was given.
Well, it is, and in part because you know, one of the main objectives of an archives is to preserve information for future use. Now, part of that is tied to our Constitution. Within the Constitution, you have a certain set of rights, and you have a right to information. Now, you know, the right to access information is not necessarily spelled out specifically in there because it's tied to the freedom of expression. Okay. Right? But the logic here is how can you express yourself objectively, especially with regards to you know, a public entity, if you don't have the correct information to make your assertions.
To do that, yeah.
Right. So you know, the whole matter of archives and records management is tied to our human rights and the rights that are protected under the Constitution. So it becomes important to ensure that those rights are preserved by preserving the records that would enable people to make you know, clear decisions and objective decisions. So, you know, in coming forward now, we were established to not only ensure that the archives were safe, but also to ensure that other records that are being created on a daily basis have an opportunity to make it to being archives. Because, as I mentioned earlier, we've had quite a number of mishaps, accidents, and, you know, things happen. You know, obviously, you know, we can't control everything. But, you know, we want to ensure that we employ as as many good records-keeping practices as possible to ensure that we don't lose any vital information that someone may want to have access to in the future, or even in the near future,
present,
right? Yeah. So there's quite a bit that we're responsible for. The unit also has a responsibility to ensure that we sort of assist government with making the correct sort of decisions when it comes to putting in place certain things for, say, e-government, for instance. As the e-government initiative rolls on, there's a responsibility that government has to ensure that the records that are created from the transactions that will be forthcoming, that the records are managed properly. And so, that's another side to it as well. And I don't want to preempt you. I think you may want to discuss freedom of information at some point, but we also have a responsibility to ensure that people understand what their rights are in terms of accessing information.
Awesome. So during the break, we just touched on about an example of why records management is important to a society. So it's not just about maybe government should be concerned about how well they manage their records and preserving them, but that it's for the entire society for various reasons.
Yeah. Well, we are responsible for giving guidance not only to public offices, but also to private entities as well, individuals and private companies. So we don't discriminate in that regard.
So persons can contact you from a company and ask for assistance with putting best practices in place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we also give guidance with regard to people, people in their homes. They may want to know, well, how should I best keep my records at home? What can I put in place to ensure that, if there's a flood in my house, that all my papers don't get wet and messed up and so on. And we do have a few individuals who are sort of keeping their own archives at home. We have one lady in particular, very dear soul to us. She's always talking to us about a lot of the material that she's keeping, because she keeps a lot of different things.
She sounds like my mom.
Yeah, and so we always have these conversations about material that she's keeping, and there are times when she'll actually loan us material to digitize, and then we'll send back to her and so on. Yeah. So,
and I'd like to just interject there, because it's very interesting, and I guess part of it was because my mom was a teacher, so she would collect things keep magazines and different booklets and material like that, for our school projects. But then I realized now, as I've gotten older, the value in doing something like that. Because then we're able to go back and, she might have, let's say, for example, a booklet from when the Queen visited, and those are precious information or valuable information that we should keep a hold of. And I find when it comes to genealogy, funeral booklets are the best, because then you get a whole family tree that right there laid out in black and white. So when persons I know persons collect those for that very same purpose, because then you're able to have that information at a later point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we do. It's interesting that you mentioned that. We do scan funeral booklets as well, because we have found that sometimes, this is the only way that you get to sort of get a person's life in a snapshot, and that funeral book with the eulogy and with the photographs and everything else sort of gives you a snapshot into who that person was. And so we also have, I mentioned that dear soul to us who loans us material, but we do also have a number of other people who will collect funeral books, bring them to us to scan. In some cases they'll donate them, in some cases they'll just loan them to us. But we've been building those relationships over time to ensure that we can maintain some record of private individuals, so that we don't just make it all about government and public material, but
and then everything else is lost, because all of that is important in terms of capturing the history of the country.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Awesome. Okay, so back to the company example.
Yes. So so we have this item in the news regarding the trust company that was fined by FSC. The news broke yesterday. But one of the areas that they were noted as not doing as well as they should have been doing, and is records keeping. And so this points to part of the reason for proper records management within our society. I think to a greater degree, most people are sort of oblivious to how good records keeping sort of translates into daily life. But this is just one sort of example of how not keeping adequate records can affect the wider society, because we have that situation with the Panama Papers that took place, and this is a direct outfall from that. And so it doesn't bode well for our financial services industry when we have those sorts of cases coming up. And so it sort of highlights the need to ensure that records management is something that is paramount, both in a corporate sense, in a government sense, and in a private sense as well.
Yeah. Awesome. That's very key. So we understand in terms of, again, it's applicable to everybody, not just government, because a lot of times, I know persons, they don't keep any kind of records personally at all, and even bank statements.
Right.
And again, we don't know when you're going to be in need of them. So it's important to have some type of record keeping. And we'll talk about that right after this break in terms of, what should an individual do? Because sometimes I think I keep too much paper. And other times it's like, I think I need to hold on to this. So you're going to give us some guidance tonight in terms of how to organize our little filing cabinet.
I will try my best.
All right. You're tuned in to the Vigilate Dialogue. I'm your host, Shaina Smith. We've been talking tonight about archives and record management. And we're going to get a word now from our sponsors and be right back. Welcome back. You're tuned in to the Vigilate Dialogues. I'm your host, Shaina Smith. And with me this evening, I have Mr. Christopher Varlack, the Chief Records Management Officer, who's been sharing with us the importance of archiving and records management to our country. So it's not just something for government to do, but everybody, including those of us at home. So just before the break, we were talking about that even individuals should have some type of record keeping, as it were. We know from a business standpoint that that's very important. And even, sometimes I'm surprised when I find businesses that don't keep very good records. But, I think it comes from an individual level where if they don't really practice it as an individual, it's not necessarily translated into the business. So let's talk about some of the basic home record management, as it were, as far as, again, preserving things like our birth certificates, vaccination cards for our children, those types of things.
Yes. Well,
what records we should be keeping.
Yeah, well, you just mentioned some of the vital records, yes, that anybody would want to keep for identification purposes. It becomes very important when you're applying for passports, when you're applying for national health insurance, when you're applying for anything that requires you to prove who you are and where you're from and where you were born and so on. So those are key. But it's also important, I think, as you mentioned earlier, to ensure that you keep good records for your bills. You ensure that when someone says that they're charging you a certain amount, that you for the sake of not having to pay them more money than you're actually supposed to pay them, that you keep your bills organized, and that you actually look for guidance on how to retain these records and for what period you need to keep them and so on. We do have some guidance that we can afford people for the sake of keeping good records at home, but I would advise anybody, invest in a good file cabinet. If you can get it fireproof, do that. Invest in a good safe. If you can get it fireproof, do that. And ensure that you keep your most valuable records locked up and, in case of anything, and high off the ground. I think one of the things that we feel is that, as long as we put them, just anywhere, that they'll be okay, or we can put them on the bottom shelf because they're not that important. But, then, a pipe breaks in your house and you have all this water gushing through and, your materials get damaged. And, so you want to avoid those types of things. And it's just good practice. And, if anybody wants more information on that, they can always contact the unit and, we'll provide them with the details on what they can do.
Okay, great. And then we'll give that information at the end. Let's pivot a little bit. Let's talk about careers in record management. Because again, I know we may have some young persons like records management. What is that? What are some of the career opportunities or the career paths that someone can, study? Because what I find very interesting when I was thinking about it was like, what kind of degree do you study in order to become the chief records management officer or become an archivist?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you have a number of programs around the world that are geared towards raising up archivists and records managers. You can study for a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or a postgraduate diploma or a postgraduate certificate in archives and records management. And there are a number of schools, throughout the world, Canada, the United States. In fact, UWI has just started up their program in Jamaica. And I think there are a couple persons here who are going to be writing material for that program as well. So we also have schools that do online teaching as well, which makes that, makes it very convenient. So you can, study from wherever you are. And, there may be a need to take, a trip to the classroom.
To actual campus.
Right, for 1 or 2 weeks or something. But, they're making it more and more convenient these days. In terms of actual careers, you can become a records manager. You can become an archivist if that's what you choose. One of the sort of dying fields right now, but still very needed, still very much in demand, is conservation. And that requires someone who may have an interest in science. And because what you actually do is you get into how can you repair various types of paper. It may not be just regular.
So the document from 1770 might be a little tattered. Trying to figure out how to keep it around for another 100 years.
Yes, it may be burned. The iron gall ink that they used back then actually oxidizes because it has iron in it.
So it rusts?
Exactly. Essentially, it rusts and it burns through, and then you wind up with these holes where the letters were.
Oh, that's where that comes from.
Yeah.
I was wondering about that.
Yeah, and then the yellowing on the paper is, comes from the dehydration when the paper itself dries out and, it starts to get brittle because it doesn't have moisture. It's not supple. And
see, this is science right here.
Yeah, and so, conservators learn how to restore these materials. And there are actually companies like Ancestry.com and others that have been employing sort of forensic techniques to ensure that you can actually find, because in some cases the ink fades, but there are techniques that they can use to actually find out what was there and then restore the lettering. So yeah, it's very fascinating, very, very fascinating work. We had a conservator here, I believe it was last year, and she did a workshop with some of our public officers and provided them with some guidance on
Okay.
on good records keeping practices. So it's a great it's a great field, very much in demand. Conservators, because you have less and less of them in the world, they're becoming more and more in demand. So in places, especially like in Europe and elsewhere, where the preservation of old documents is a big thing.
Yeah.
And
there's a high volume,
yeah,
even more documents
right,
than we could even think of.
Yeah, you could do very well as an experienced conservator in that environment.
Okay.
And I would like to see some of our young people take an interest in that and see if they can try to work with us to restore some of the physical documents, because it's great to to digitize the material and have it there electronically. But if we could actually restore some of the documents that have that have been the original that have been damaged, that would be great, because there are people. We had a gentleman here a few weeks ago from London. Well, I don't know if I should say where he was from, but it was a very important place. And he had been to Antigua, he had been to Barbados looking for certain documents, and he didn't find them there. He found them here.
Okay.
So it's important that we can actually preserve these materials and keep them for future use.
Yeah, very key. And I think it's something that's overlooked in terms of, we talk about history, but preserving our history has a large part to do with the documentation of that history.
Yeah.
And being able to have the records or the artifacts or whatever the information was, however it was generated, so that, again, the future generations can look back and know, this is what took place, this is who was involved,
yes,
and all the important dates and different things like that. So it's so key. So I thought it very important that we have this conversation tonight in terms of putting, more information on there in terms of persons becoming more knowledgeable in terms of record management. So I'm so happy. So, and then now we have another, sounds like there's job security in becoming a conservationist. So something we're putting out there tonight.
Yeah, perhaps. If I can add to that, I recently made a presentation at the Elmore Stout High School to a number of students, and there were a few of them who actually signed up. They were very eager to sign up for a program that we're attempting to start at the high school, to sort of raise up the next generation of records managers and archivists. And our development as a unit and as an agency has been a little slow. We're not of the highest priority, because we have all of these other major things going on. But I think we're doing what we can, and we're trying to see where we can make inroads and appeal to not just the older generation, but the younger generation as well. Yeah. And we, usually during the summers, we do have students who come in to work with microfilm and work with us. And some of them are very fascinated. They see on movies microfilm readers, and they've never seen one in real life, and then they come in and they're fascinated. Yeah. And then what fascinates some of them even more is that they're able to go in and look at some of the old newspapers and see what the BVI was like back in the 1950s and the 1960s, because they have no clue. And, it just blows their mind in some cases. So we really want to appeal to more young people and to get them interested in what we're doing.
In that, okay, yeah. Awesome. All right, so we're gonna pause there, take another commercial break, and when we come back, we're gonna talk about the all-important freedom of information, because we talked about keeping information, but we hear a lot about having access to that information and how we go about that. So we'll take a word now from our sponsors, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. You're tuned in to the Vigilate Dialogues. I'm your host, Shaina Smith, and welcoming you to the National Boardroom, where tonight we've been talking about archiving and records management. My guest tonight is Mr. Christopher Varlack, the Chief Records Management Officer at the Archives and Records Management Unit in the Government of the Virgin Islands. So we have touched already on the unit, the services. We talked about persons being able to contact you about best practices in whether it's a corporate setting or an individual setting, as far as it's very important for us to keep important records safe and secure, and also persons having access to the archives and the information that is there. And also the job security and careers in record management is, we're never going to not have a time, I think, where we're keeping records. Again, whether because of technology we move from paper-based to electronics, it's still a record and it still has to be managed.
Yes.
And we want to preserve our history, so that's where the archiving comes in, where we're trying to keep them as long as possible, basically.
Yeah.
So, and you shared with us that we have documents as old as the 1700s.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So let's talk now about freedom of information. We sometimes hear this as a buzzword, but I don't know if I'm clear exactly about what that means. And you mentioned earlier in the program about the Constitution and what it guarantees us in terms of right to information, and what we should be able to know about or have access to know about in terms of living in a society. So share with us what is freedom of information, and what does that mean to us?
Yeah, well, freedom of information is a term given to being able to access information that is created by public authorities, under a proper regime. In other words, you just don't have the opportunity to walk up and say, I want to see that. And you get it.
It just shows up, yeah.
Right, yeah. There are guidelines for how you're supposed to access that information. But essentially, it's a means by which the public can have greater access to information that is created or that is held in government offices, to ensure that there is transparency and good governance taking place. The Freedom of Information Act in the BVI, I think, has been drafted for quite some time. And I think over time, there's been quite a bit of discussion surrounding freedom of information. I know certainly in the media, there have been quite a few people who have put requests out, through the newspapers or through the online news sites to say, we want freedom of information, we want freedom of information. As that relates to the archives, because we're responsible for preserving information and for giving guidance on good record keeping, it relates directly, because then this is the same type of information that people would want to see. Although in its archival stage, it actually becomes what you call, it actually moves into its open access period, where there aren't, all of these sort of rules and guidelines that are, enshrined in legislation to say how you should access or what you can access.
Okay.
In their open access period, what may have been classified, is now declassified.
Okay,
and
that's
so,
the first thing came to my
on.
mind, actually, because in the U.S. you hear sometimes talk about, okay, they released the records from CIA and there was some situation 30 years ago,
Yes.
but they've declassified that information and now it's accessible to the public.
Yes.
Okay.
But it should be noted that the decision in certain cases where classified information is passed to the archives, there is still what's the word I'm looking for? There's still
Restrictions?
some discretion that the creating agency may choose to employ at that point, because
So you can't see page 5.
even at that point, there is a relationship between the archives and the creating agency.
Okay.
And similar to, I guess, anywhere else in the world, they could say, well, for the purposes of national security, we can't allow that
Release
to be seen.
this particular information.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So it just depends. There's a lot of consideration to be made in that regard.
Okay. So it's not a free for all when we talk about freedom of information, but that there is a structure to it and a process in terms of what you can actually have access to and how much of it.
Yes, absolutely. And freedom of information relates more to records in their current period. In other words, they haven't been transferred to the archives. They haven't necessarily been with the archives, for any length of time. This is information that's actually still in government offices.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is that there's certain records that, upon being laid in the house or at the time of creation, they actually become public documents, and the public should have access to them by some means. But then there are a lot of other records that are created, and there's not an actual mechanism for anyone to have access to them if they request that. So that Freedom of Information legislation puts in place those guidelines for how usually current information should be accessed, from the government, and it gives private individuals the opportunity to make requests and to have their requests considered and obtain the information if that request is granted.
Okay. So one of the things that just actually popped to mind is in terms of statistical data.
Yeah.
Is that also under your remit, or would that rest with the Central Statistics Office?
Well, again, it depends on when the statistics were created. I've had a few conversations with the Central Statistics Office regarding old censuses. We have certain individuals who are looking for old census information, and in some cases they think that the censuses are conducted the same way as they are in the United States, and the same type of information is collected. I think there's a slight difference here. We do have in the archives slave records and slave registers, and many of those registers were created by taking a census. I believe there was a requirement that the plantation owners had to submit every few years a record of how many slaves they had and so on. And so people will actually be able to go to those records and trace based on the plantation owner's name and so on, family members and so on. So some people are actually going all that way back to see who their ancestors were. But then coming forward, some people want to see more current statistical data with regard to censuses and so on. And so, again, depending on the year, we may have it, or it may still remain with the Central Statistics Office.
Okay. So that would be the more or less the current and active information, so to speak. We would request that from the CSO.
Yes.
And then something from 100 years ago will come look for you.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, we're winding down now, so let's start off by letting persons know again where to find you and how they can reach you.
Okay.
For information.
Sure. Well, we are located upstairs, the Burham building, in the same office space as the Civil Registry.
Okay.
And I think a lot of people are more familiar with the Civil Registry because it's, where you go to get your
birth desk.
Your birth, right?
Everybody knows that.
Right. And they stay busy over there. And our phone number is 284-468-3044. If you want to contact us by fax, it is 284-468-256. Oh man, I'm forgetting my fax number.
Okay, we'll call you to get the fax.
Thank you. Call me to get the fax number.
Yeah.
And if anyone wants to contact us by email, they can just call us and get the other information, or they can visit we have a website. It is nationalarchives.gov.vg. Our contact information is there. And then we also have a page on the government's website.
Okay.
So they would go to the government website. I think it's BVI.gov. What is it?
BVI.gov.vg.
There you go.
There you go.
BVI.gov.vg, and look for us in the search field, and our information should come up.
Okay. Awesome. All right. Well, Mr. Varlack, it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation. Now I learned why there are holes in paper in old documents. That was very interesting because again, you know, we hear about records management and we think of it as being something that's pretty simple, you know, and not much to it. But you know, tonight we've learned quite a bit in terms of the importance of keeping records and also preserving them for future reference, whether by us or, you know, those that are coming after us. So I think that's very, very good information we got out tonight. So again, if you're interested in doing some, whether it's family research or maybe even for a paper, in addition now to the library, you have another resource center that you can, you know, take advantage of and go and look at the Archives and Record Management Unit. Right? So
Absolutely.
It's the same entrance as Civil Registry, or you guys have a separate entrance on the other side by varieties?
Yeah, there are two doors.
Okay.
One is closer to the Omar Hodge building.
Okay.
If people want to come up those stairs, then they can come up and see us. But you know, normally if people come in on the Civil Registry side, you know, they'll direct them down. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here. And anything in terms of activities coming up, you know, be sure to drop by the National War Room and let us know.
We will, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been tuned in to the Vigilate Dialogues. I'm your host, Shaina Smith, inviting you to join us here on CBN TV, Channel 51, on Mondays at 8 p.m. and also on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. And you can also catch us at any time on our YouTube channel, the Vigilate Dialogues. I am your host saying, let us continue the change in conversation for a better Virgin Islands.